Hi everyone, welcome to this second session of our natural dyeing course. And this session is all about getting started. We're going to do an overview of the dyeing process and a look at all of the equipment that you need in order to do the process successfully. So when we think about natural dyeing, we can separate it into three different areas. The first area is preparation, and this is so important because it lays the groundworks for all of the steps and stages that come after it. As an example, I like to think of it a bit like when you are creating a garment, the first person in the process has to cut the fabric from the pattern. And if that person, leaves a bit too much width between the fabric, or if they do it wonky or not straight, then that means that the next person down the line, the sewer, will have a really difficult job making that garment look good and fit right. And that's a bit like this stage. If we do the preparation really well, if we wash the fabric really well and go through all the different steps, then it really helps us in the following stages. So preparation is key. The second area is extracting the dye colour from the plants. And this stage is a bit like cooking. We have to prepare and weigh the plants, and then we have to boil the water, the dye, so that the colour is released from the plants. And then the third stage is dyeing our fabric. And this is the part that takes some real patience. We have to immerse the fabric into the dye. So it's bringing together the fabric that we prepared in area 1 with the dye that we extracted in area 2 into area 3. And they come together so that the dye covers the fabric and they mix together and produce what we're looking for. Separating the process into these three areas really helps in when we think about what we need to do, at which stage we need to do it. And so a really important kind of understanding before we move on is that for us to create beautiful fabric like the yellow fabric in this picture, we need to create a few different layers of dyes in order for that colour to stick to the fabric so that it doesn't fade or get lighter with washing or in the sun. We need to create that colour really strong, especially if we're planning to make accessories or clothing from that fabric. In order to do that, we need to go through three different layers of processes. The first layer, which is this bottom layer here, is an invisible layer. We can't see it. There's no colour. And this is our fixer dye, also known as a mordant. And this is the first layer which helps the colour to stick. And if we just did that layer, then it would work, it would be good. But we want to make sure that we have really good fabric. So we're going to do a middle layer, the second layer. And that layer is going to be a much lighter yellow or light brown dye, and that dye is called a tannin, and tannins are really good at helping the final colour, which is usually the brighter colour, stick and be really strong. So we've got three layers: the invisible layer, the light layer, and then the final colour. And these three layers come together to produce a really good naturally dyed fabric. If this is a bit confusing right now, don't worry. As we go through this video, hopefully it will all become much clearer. So when we're talking about preparation, the first stage is cutting our fabric. Now, usually we don't want to cut strips of fabric any larger than 2 meters, but it depends a bit on the width of our fabric, because we want the fabric to be able to move freely in the bucket. If the fabric is too scrunched in the dye bucket, then we might get patches on the fabric, which we don't want. So once we've decided on our fabric, on the size of our fabric, and this is also informed by the final product that we're making, because we need to make sure that the pattern fits to that size of fabric. We need to weigh it. And weighing the fabric is really key because that weight of fabric is going to inform the weight of our mordant, the weight of our plants, the weight of our washing powder that we use. So we need to get our notebooks out and make a note about what the weight is. And then we're going to wash our fabric. So in Mayamiko, we'll probably be doing this in the bath or in a really big bucket. And we're going to add some washing powder or soda ash to make sure that the fabric is really clean, that any dirt from the weaving process is gone and it's ready for dyeing. And we're going to use hot boiling water for this, and we need to then rinse all of that washing powder out with cool water so that there's no trace of the washing powder afterwards. And then it's time for us to put our fabric into that first layer, the mordant, the fixing layer, the fixing dye, and this is the invisible part. But we're going to do a whole session on just mordants. So don't worry if you don't understand this now. I just want you to know that it's part of this first area of preparation. So the next session, the next area that we're going to move into is extracting the dye colour from the plants. And to do this, we need to start by washing and preparing the dye plants. So we need to get all of that dirt from the leaves. We need to sometimes peel skins or layers of different plants. All of that needs to be done. And then we're going to weigh those dye plants. So the weight of dye plants is determined by the weight of our fabric piece that we're using. And then we can add those dye plants into the dye pot and fill and cover it with cool water, just so that it covers the plants. And then we're going to slowly heat that water to bring it to a gentle simmer to extract the colour. And our third stage is dyeing the fabric. So we're going to make sure that the fabric is washed first, because remember, because we're doing 3 layers of this process, if we have previously just done the light brown or light yellow layer, then before putting it into the final bright colour, we need to give it a quick wash to make sure that none of that light brown colour is going to bleed into the brighter colour. So wash the fabric, and then we can then put it into our dye, and we're going to slowly put the fabric in and make sure that it's completely covered with the dye, with the water. And if it's not, then we can add more water so that it is, because any of the white fabric, if there's any white fabric sticking out of the water, that's going to stay white. And we want a really evenly dyed fabric. So there needs to be space for the fabric to move about in the bucket. We need to stir the bucket often, so every half an hour to 40 minutes, and then we're going to leave it until the next day. So when we come back into the workshop the next day, we're going to have a wonderful magical surprise that our white fabric has now hopefully turned a beautiful natural colour. And we're going to take that fabric out and we're going to wash it so that all of the dye runs clear, and then we can hang it on the washing line to dry. And it's best to do this in a shady or indoor covered space so that the sun isn't directly on the fabric. This helps really preserve the colour. And as it's drying, we might realise that the colour isn't exactly what we wanted. We might realise that it needs to be a bit darker and it needs to go back into the dye. And we'll talk about in one of the videos how we solve any problems that arise, because they will come up, and we need to give you the tools and the ideas of how to solve those problems if a fabric isn't exactly what you're expecting. So those 3 areas, that's kind of how it plans out. But as I mentioned, because we're aiming for those 3 layers on each piece of fabric, we're going to have to repeat area 2 and area 3 twice, because we want to get that light brown or light yellow from the tannin, our second layer. And then we're also going to want to get our brighter layer. So here we've got the pomegranate skins yellow. And so the extracting the dye, we're going to have to extract both the tannin from, which is usually from a nut or a bark or a leaf, and we're also going to have to extract the colour. So for instance, the pomegranate skins. So we're going to have to go through that process twice, but that will become more clear as we break everything down. So like I mentioned, we are working towards these 3 layers on each piece of fabric. So the invisible mordant and then that light brown colour up at the top, and then the final layer, which in this case is a bright yellow, which we can see here, the final pomegranate skins. So that's how we get these beautiful pieces of fabric, and it is a long process and it's a lot of work, but we'll be able to speed up as we go along, and I think it'll be a really satisfying journey for you to be able to use waste products like food waste or locally found nuts and leaves to create these beautiful fabrics. And so I wanted to bring all of that information together in this really short video, which takes you inside the workshop in Sri Lanka. And so this follows our team in Sri Lanka doing the avocado dyeing, and it's a really sped up version, but I want you to take a look at our workspace as well, because it shows you how we've kind of laid out the buckets and where our cooking and boiling area is. And so become familiar with the workspace, because we're going to be creating something similar, although there'll be differences in Malawi.
Amma brown color.
Hola, mi sutuna.
Amma, mother made.
So that was the journey from taking those avocado stones to creating a piece of fabric which we can then create products out of. And so I hope that brought all of everything together. And our workspace in Sri Lanka involves an indoor kitchen, and which is where we cook everything, which is where we boil all of the dyes and weigh all of the dyes and store everything. And then we have an indoor/outdoor area, which has got running water. It's where we wash our fabrics and where we have most of our buckets where all of the dyes are kept. And then we have another space which has got a washing line, which we can dry the fabrics once they're finished. And so I know that in Malawi, in Mayamiko, we're going to be probably cooking and boiling most of the plants outside, which is great. And we just need to build a setup where we can keep and store the buckets in a shaded area so that the heat doesn't make the dyes go too moldy or make them ferment. We'll just have to figure out a way of creating a workspace. But maybe now you've seen that, have a think about where in the workshop would be good to set things up. And for instance, for washing the fabrics, we can use the bath, and we can use different areas to make it work. So when it comes to the equipment, we are going to need aluminium cooking pots. And so we're going to need 2 or 3 of these to start, because we're going to need one for boiling water, one for boiling our invisible mordant, and one for boiling our different dye plants. We're going to need large plastic buckets to hold all of the dyes, and it's really good to have a different bucket for each of the colours so that we don't have any mixing, which sometimes you can get marks and things. And it's really important that the buckets have got lids, because sometimes if insects or if flies get into the buckets, then they can stain the fabric. We're going to need weighing scales so that we can accurately measure our fabric and plants. And we're going to need some form of fire. So in Malawi, in Mayamiko, we're going to use coal, but in Sri Lanka, we use gas. So whatever is available. We're going to need utensils, so wooden spoons to stir the dyes, or if it's easier, you can make a long stick, which is what our workshop manager in Sri Lanka uses, so she doesn't have to bend down so much. So whatever suits you. We're going to need a light piece of cloth to put over the metal sieve so that we can collect all of the small bits of plants so that none of them fall into the bucket. Sometimes if they fall into the bucket, then they can mark or stain the fabric. And we're going to need rubber gloves to protect our hands, because although they're non-toxic dyes, when we're often washing things, our skin can sometimes go a bit greasy, can't it? And it's just much safer practice to wear gloves. And we're going to need a notebook and pen to keep a record of our samples and recipes as we go. We need an apron to protect ourselves, and we need a washing line and drying space. And then in addition to that, it's also good to have some scissors handy, a face mask for when we are like weighing out powders, a water source, so an indoor and outdoor tap, different containers to store our dye plants, or bags could also work, and then a mixture of small buckets alongside those large dyeing buckets, because they're really helpful when we're extracting the dyes to sometimes have a smaller bucket to put things in. A pH meter, which is a piece of equipment that we use to test the water quality, because the pH, which is the level of acid or alkaline of the water, really sometimes affects the colour. And then a hand grinder or something to grind down plants, because we're going to be experimenting with creating some dyeing pastes so that we can start printing as well. And then of course we need our plants, we need our fabric, we need washing powder or soda ash, and we need our alum for mordanting. So I hope this session has given you a really good insight into the whole view of the process, and that it's got you excited, and it may have also meant that you've got some questions to ask already. And so write those questions down, because they're really important. And then the next kind of series of videos are going to be about jumping into each of those individual steps within our 3 different areas. So you'll have a really good understanding of practically how to do those processes, and you'll be able to start experimenting, and I'll do some demonstrations so that you understand what to do.